Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Texas believes in honest conversations like the one you're about to see. For thoughtful insights related to healthcare policy, check out our Blue Promise podcast and videos. Learn more at standingwithtexas.com.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Patrick Svitek, and I want to thank you all for tuning in to today's virtual event from the Texas Tribune. I'm here today with Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate, Royce West. We'll be discussing his 2020 campaign ahead of the runoff election on Tuesday and what it's like on the virtual campaign trail until about 12:45 p.m. this afternoon. We'll also be going over questions submitted by our readers throughout the conversation. Before we get started, we want to thank our sponsors, AT&T, Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Texas, Texas 2036, and Walmart. We also want to thank KXAN for their media support. Though donors and corporate sponsors underwrite our events, they play no role in determining the content, panelists, or line of questioning. Finally, I'd like to introduce today's guest, State Senator Royce West. Senator West has represented Senate District 23 since 1993. In the 87th legislative session, he served as Vice Chair of the Senate Higher Education Committee and sat on the Education, Finance, and Transportation Committees. Last July, he announced his candidacy for the U.S. Senate. In March, West got the second highest vote total in the 12-way primary, sending him to a runoff against M.J. Hegar, the retired Air Force helicopter pilot who has the endorsement of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. The winner of next Tuesday's runoff will face Republican Senator John Cornyn in November. Senator West, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure, Patrick.
So there's no doubt this runoff has gotten a little contentious in the past week and a half or so. But first, I just want to talk about more broadly the moment that the country is in. Obviously, two of the big issues that have played out nationally, and you can even argue internationally, throughout this runoff have been the coronavirus pandemic, and then the death of George Floyd, the protests that followed, and the issues that came even more front and center in the wake of that. Just broadly speaking, when you look at those issues, can you tell me how those two issues have changed the campaign that you had maybe expected to run when you learned in early March that you'd be in this runoff?
A great example in terms of how it's changed the campaign. You and I would probably be sitting down on a personal basis having this conversation, as opposed to it just being done by Skype. That's one great example of it. And obviously, the number of people that are hurting right now throughout this country and throughout the state of Texas. And frankly, at the beginning of the runoff election, I had to change my focus from the campaign, Patrick, to making certain I discharge my responsibilities as a state senator. And from that vantage point, I had to make certain that my constituents, who were essential workers, many of them essential and non-essential, that were being laid off, making certain they were able to get into the Texas Workforce Commission. You know exactly what the bottleneck was there, and people were calling me left and right. People also looking at issues concerning food and things like that. So I had to stop my campaign as a U.S. Senator, not knowing exactly how it was going to roll out, given that it had to be, we had another alternative. And from a vantage point, it wasn't until like mid-April before I could even focus with any certainty on exactly what we were going to be doing. And then we recognized that it would have to be a virtual campaign. And as a result of that, we've been able to go to all 254 counties, albeit by virtual town hall and communication, community forums.
Right. When it comes to the response to the coronavirus, I'm sure as a state senator, you have some thoughts on how the state has responded and how Governor Abbott has responded. But when you look at the federal response, specifically what's happened in Congress, what's one or two things that you would have done differently from what Senator Cornyn has done over the past few months when you look at the policy or just the overall approach that Congress has taken to this pandemic?
I would not be following Donald Trump over the cliff like Cornyn is doing. Frankly, everything that Trump is doing, he's pretty much rubber stamped, and he's been doing that pretty much his entire legislative career, unfortunately. And when you begin to think about the healthcare issue as an example, how many times has he voted against the Affordable Care Act? And so you think about the response that the president has had. And obviously he's the chief executive. He wants to make like this has never happened before. The issue concerning testing, John Cornyn was real slow and still is pretty slow at saying we need to have widespread testing and more persons being tested. And frankly, I hadn't heard him say anything about the hot spots within our communities, specifically the minority communities that are dying at a disproportionate rate than others? What are we doing in order to make certain that we get the statistics on that and in order to make sure we adequately address it? Now, again, I recognize that this is a pandemic that many of us have never witnessed before in our life. And a lot of times it's an issue of first impression. But even though it's an issue of first impression, we should learn by our mistakes. Trump has not learned by his mistakes. Cornyn is not saying anything, as far as I'm heard, and looking at the Tribune, about Trump's position on this issue. And the nonsensical approach that Trump has taken is kind of being seconded by Cornyn. We shouldn't be wearing masks. When CDC, Trump's own administration, is saying that everyone should in fact be wearing masks, and then we use that as a divisive issue, saying people that wear masks are Democrats and those that don't are Republican. Nonsensical. We need to make certain we have someone that can pull people together as opposed to continuing to divide us. And that's the problem that we're having right now with not only the pandemic, but with coronavirus, but other issues also.
On that second big issue I mentioned from the outset, George Floyd's death, what's something that, regardless of political gridlock in Congress, what's one policy you'd like to see come out of that, regardless of whether it could get passed in Congress or not? If you could pinpoint one ideal policy to come out of that.
Patrick, let me answer your question. Let me give you a little background first, and also that those persons that are listening can understand my perspective on this issue. I have been an assistant district attorney in Dallas. I was the first ethnic minority to be a chief felony prosecutor. I ran for district attorney in Dallas County. I practiced some criminal law, and I served on the Criminal Justice Committee in the state Senate for probably about 10 years. So that's the perspective that I bring to this issue. And I'm an African-American man. I have been the victim of what I perceived as wrongful stops and searches by police officers. Now, don't get me wrong. Let me say this from the outset. I have a lot of friends that are police officers, and they want to leave home in the morning and go back home in the evening. But the problem is this. We have a few of these officers that misuse the power that has been entrusted to them by state law. And so, to answer your question, one policy that's not being considered in any great detail right now is the standardization on the use of deadly force across this country. We should not have 50 states with 50 different laws on when a police officer can use deadly force. You take a life in Georgia, it's just as valuable if you take a life in Texas. And so we should have a standardization of the law concerning the use of deadly force across this country. And the federal government should be able to suggest very strongly to states that they implement that standardization. Yes, it will be an uphill battle, but I'm used to uphill battles. When I passed the body camera law and the dash camera laws here in the state of Texas, it was an uphill battle. But we should be able to bring people together and agree that we shouldn't have different standards across this country on the use of deadly force. We shouldn't have different police policies in law enforcement agencies concerning the use of deadly force. That ought to be a conversation that all stakeholders have and we do something about.
Is that something you think you can build consensus on with Republicans? And I know from the outset I asked you to name your ideal policies, so I won't try to make it too unfair. But if not that policy, is there another one when we talk about what is currently realistic in Congress that you think that can get done?
Well, in terms of what the Senate agenda is, I wholeheartedly agree that it needs to be more substantive than what it currently is. Frankly, I couldn't even tell you what it is because it looks like Kool-Aid Light to me, okay? If we're going to be serious about this, you have 76% of people in this country that recognize that racism exists and that, yes, Black Lives Matter, in spite of what some of the politicians in the state of Texas will say, that the Black Lives Matter organization is a viable organization and some of their policies need to be looked to. Now, don't get me wrong, and I'll say, and there are always fringes within all organizations, like the Ku Klux Klan, like these white supremacist groups, but they're not considered communist groups. But let me go back to what you were asking. The fact is that we should be able to come up with some things as it relates to no-knock warrants, as it relates to no chokeholds, as opposed to encouraging police departments not to do that. We ought to make certain that they don't do it. We need to look at qualified immunity. We've got to look at the tough issues. And if you don't have persons on both sides of the aisle that are willing to sit down and look at the tough issues in order to have structural change, we're not going to get anything done.
Before we move on here, we have a reader question that I think kind of touches on both these two topics that we've discussed. This is coming from Gloria, and this is her question. She says, the systemic racism in Texas healthcare that was quietly killing Black and Latino people due to the lack of insurance from chronic conditions before COVID-19 and today because of it is now blaring obvious. What are you going to do to stop this injustice?
Let me say, Gloria, thank you for that question. First of all, let me say elections matter. And I have worked feverishly in order to expand Medicaid in this state. Ever since President Obama passed the Affordable Care Act, the state of Texas could have received $10 billion a year if it had expanded Medicaid. But my Republicans, brothers and sisters, decided that it was not feasible to do because they thought that the federal government would run out of money. No, that wasn't the reason. The reason was exactly what Mitch McConnell has said. He wanted to make certain that everything, number one, that Obama was a one-term president, and now he, along with Trump and Cornyn, are trying to erase everything that President Obama has done. Until we are able to get the state leadership to expand Medicaid in this state to cover persons with pre-existing conditions, okay, that you're talking about, and also deal with the healthcare deserts, we're not going to be able to get it done because you see, Gloria, it's a partnership between the federal government and the state government. And if the state government is not willing to address this issue, it won't become a priority, and it will only continue to get some lip service, and that's about it. And I'm gonna tell you why I say that. When you begin to look at our budget, we always underestimate the Medicaid caseload, only to have to come back the next legislative session and pass what we call a supplemental appropriation bill in order to backfill the monies that were necessary, Patrick, in order to provide the monies for Medicaid. So, Gloria, the answer to your question is this. I will work with whomever, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, to make certain we put people in office who recognize the need to expand health services in this state and make it a priority.
On the earlier, I talked about broadly the moment this country is in, more specifically on the political moment we're in. You and I talked for an interview a couple of weeks ago, and I think you've said this to other media outlets. You said you felt like the stars have kind of aligned for you in this runoff. Make that case. I mean, again, focusing, we talked a little bit about substance and policy, but on the political side of this, why do you think there is this momentum, on your side politically that you shared with me earlier?
Well, a couple of reasons. Because of the number of people that are contacting us now that are supportive of the campaign that didn't do it before. And the number one issue that they're talking about is, in fact, this issue of racism in this country. And I think that more and more people, both Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, are saying, yes, Black Lives Matter. There was a Politico poll that 76% of America recognize that racism is alive and well in America, and we must do something about it. I think that because of my background that I just mentioned to you a second ago, and also my legislative track record, I show the sensitivity to the issue, not only the sensitivity to the issue, but doing something about the issue. Granddaddy told me a long time ago, and I told you this a couple of weeks ago, you can kind of look at what a person's done in the past to see exactly what they're going to do in the future. And when people look at my past, they know I have been tackling this systemic issue, as well as systemic racism in terms of education, healthcare, you name it. I have been dealing with this issue across the board, and that I have the experience. People recognize that. The more people know about it, the more inclined they are to support me as the U.S. Senate candidate.
How has your campaign been measuring that momentum? Obviously, we're in this virtual world where you can't always see, how many people turn out to an event or something like that. We still have fundraising, and there's still a gap there, at least as of the latest reports. But just tell me a little bit about the metrics that you guys are looking at in the end here, to support the argument that there is momentum on your side.
Well, what we're looking at is the number of people that have been responding to the campaign and openly coming to the campaign saying that they want to be supportive. That's what we're doing. We don't have the $3-4 million that's been infused into this race the last couple of weeks. We don't have that, but we don't need it, frankly. We don't need it. And the reason that we don't, is because we've been pretty good fiduciaries of the monies that we have in order to get our message out. And so we're getting our message out through social media networks, and we're getting responses back from them, from persons that we send information out to. And we have trusted messengers, state representatives, Democratic elected officials in Texas. We also have the Democratic nominee, Democratic campaign candidates from the primary. All of them are supporting me. The ones at the top have been supporting me, and they're helping me to get that message out also. And I'm getting feedback from them in terms of where people are.
Right. Let's talk about MJ Hegar. You just alluded to her. Over the past couple weeks here, there's definitely been a little more back and forth than there was earlier in the runoff. I think it all kind of ramped up at that debate at the beginning of last week. But you for a while have been talking about how you view yourself as the true Democrat in this race. At that debate, you specifically talked about her voting in the 2016 Republican primary, this donation she gave to Cornyn in 2011. She has provided explanations for both of those situations, said that the vote in the primary was a quote, protest vote against Trump, and she voted for Carly Fiorina instead. She said that she gave to Cornyn because she thought that was the only way she could get a meeting with her senator. I see you laughing already. I know you don't. I know you and your campaign.
I see you're laughing also.
I'm laughing at you.
Oh, you're laughing at me. Okay. All right.
I'm just acknowledging your laughter. But walk us through those two things and why you don't buy that.
Well, I will allow the voters of the state of Texas to make the determination when you use the Gladstone flag, when you give money to Cornyn. Did she ever get the meeting? And she voted in the Republican presidential primary in 2016. And she said she voted for Carly Fiorina. Carly Fiorina wanted to do away with what? She wanted to do away with Obamacare. She wanted to restrict women's rights. And so if that's going to be a protest vote, why would you do that as opposed to vote for Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary? And so people have to judge that on their own. And from that vantage point, that's not the only piece of me being a true Democrat. I've been involved in this party since I could vote. I've been a Democrat. I've worked in order to turn Dallas County blue. Now it's dark blue. I've worked for Democratic candidates up and down the ballot. I'm not talking about what I'm going to do. I'm talking about what I have done. And again, my granddaddy, look at persons past, see what they're going to do in the future. You know what I'm going to do in the future because you can look at my past and see why I say I'm the true Democrat. I've been the chairman of a state Democratic convention. I've helped raise money for the Democratic Party. I'm not talking about what I'm going to do. I'm asking voters to look at what I have done to make certain you know that what I've done in the past, I'm more than likely going to continue to do in the future.
What do you make of this argument? And I think she kind of got to it at the debate. I know there was a little back and forth there, but she seemed to suggest that, to be successful in the general election, you're going to need to build as broad of a coalition, and you don't want to alienate folks who may be Republicans, maybe Republican leading, maybe people who've voted for Republican, voted in Republican primaries in the past. I mean, does that carry weight with you, or do you think that's just her making excuses?
That's her interpretation of it. The reality is I have a lot of support from independents, and we'll have a lot of support from Republicans that understand exactly what's going on. And, again, look at what I've been able to do, okay, in terms of legislation. Understand, I have been in a Republican-dominated legislature most of my public servant career, but I've been able to get things done. And the only way that you can get things done is to work across the aisle and make sure you develop coalitions based on interests. I've been able to do that. I understand that better than she does because I've been able to operationalize it in terms of getting effective policies that are kind of cutting edge policies, not only in Texas, but also in the country. So again, I know how to do that. And I'll continue to do that during the general election when I go up against Cornyn.
If you're the nominee, just to drill down on that a little bit, what would be your message to Republican voters and Republican-leaning voters, particularly in the context of this election cycle? Definitely understand that you have a record of working with Republicans in the state legislature, but when you look at this current political moment, this current election cycle, how would you pitch yourself to Republican and Republican-leaning voters?
I would ask my fellow Texans, who's best able to articulate and also solve the current problems that we have in this country, but make certain that Texas's best interest is on the table and considered as part of the solution. Royce West is. When you begin to think about Texans, even Texans recognize that we've got to have someone that can deal with this issue of racism. John Cornyn, what has he done? What has he done in terms of this issue of racism that's been around for over 20 years that he said there? I don't know. The only thing I've seen him do is to say that he wants to pass a bill to declare Juneteenth a national holiday. Come on, it's got to be a little more substance than that. You've had 20 years to look at that, John. You hadn't done anything about it. And so if they want a Texan that is able to understand that we've got to continue to make sure our economy is one of the top economies in the world, but also deal with the fractious issues that we have, and also the healthcare issue, the coronavirus issue, then Royce West is the person.
Right. We have another reader question, and I think it kind of reiterates what you just spoke about, but I'll give it to you to make sure this person gets their question across. It's from one of our viewers, Leon Banks, and they're asking, what is your strategy and message to beat John Cornyn? And because I'm a reporter, I'm always looking for a little difference here. Tell me what you think would be different in terms of how you'd approach the election versus MJ Hegar.
Well, I don't know how she's going to approach the election. I can tell you how I approach it. The fact is that we will look at his record. You begin to think about where he's been on immigration. How many times has he voted against an immigration bill in the Senate where you've had the majority of the senators online to be supportive of it? And then he turns around and votes against it along with Mitch McConnell because Donald Trump didn't want to do anything. What has he done in order to bring Democrats and Republicans together in the U.S. Senate in order to address the immigration issue? All right, that's a valid question. What has he done in terms of making certain that we deal with the issues concerning police brutality in this country? What has he done in terms of the issue of the guns? Yes, I understand he passed somewhat of a background check bill, but did it go far enough? No, it did not. And so I think the use of guns in this country is a big issue. And yes, I believe that we can address that issue and still maintain the intent of the Second Amendment. We can do that. And that's just a few of the things we're going to have a discussion about.
Right. Before, I have a few more questions on the general election, where the race is at, but just one last question on that debate last week. One of the things that MJ Hegar brought up, and again, it was a lot of back and forth, but just in trying to clarify where we're at in this, she seemed to bring up your stock portfolio. And there was some disagreement about what she said you had said or done in the past. But I want to definitely give an opportunity for clarity here. You said that you'll do whatever is, quote, ethically required when you get to the Senate in regard to that portfolio. Is there anything you're willing to do or advocate for beyond what is currently ethically required when it comes to senators holding stocks?
Repeat that question again.
Yeah, you said that you will do whatever is ethically required when you get to the Senate. And point taken there. I think what she was pushing at was, is there any reforms to that system that you would support beyond what is currently required? And so I think she's brought up like banning members of the Senate from buying or selling stocks while serving, or requiring them to put them in a blind trust or something like that. So I'm just trying to drill down on that line of scrutiny that she had. Are there reforms or new proposals you support on that?
Sure, and let's make sure we get it straight. She said that I've been asked, and I'd refused to say that I would put my assets in a blind trust. Sure, I'd put them in a blind trust because I think that's what is required. To the extent that we have a strong conversation about ethic reform, I'll be right there and will be supportive of that ethics reform.
Right. Are there any specific reforms that you've been able to look at since that exchange kind of put this in the center of the race?
No, I hadn't looked at any of those reforms at all. I've been focusing more on trying to deal with the structural issues of the police department and also coronavirus.
Got it. Again, back to the general election here. My colleague, Abby Livingston, interviewed MJ yesterday, and she talked about how she's confident that the party is going to come together after this runoff. I'll pose that question to you as well. But there was also a notable kind of moment there where my colleague, Abby Livingston, asked MJ Hegar if she would campaign for you if you were the nominee, and if she'd want you to campaign for her if she was the nominee, and she didn't exactly say. So I'll give you those two questions. How confident are you the party's going to come together after this, and would you campaign with MJ Hegar?
Wait a minute, hold up. She didn't exactly say. Is that what she said?
She said she's going to keep fighting for issues she cares about, like immigration and healthcare, in whatever form that may take. So
well, I'll say the same thing. I'll continue to fight for issues I care about, and immigration, healthcare, reforming of the criminal justice system, and for the Democratic Party, because it's important to win this fall.
But would you,
let me say it again. This is my response. My response is exactly what my response is. Okay.
Okay. So you're in the same boat. You're going to continue to fight for those issues.
No, I'm going to fight for those issues. But what I will tell you is that if for some reason I don't win, and MJ wants to have a conversation, I don't have a problem having that conversation. Okay. This isn't personal. This is not personal. So it's about who the best candidate is. And so I'm willing to sit down, visit with her, figure out whether or not we can campaign together. And if we can, we will. I think it's in the best interest of the Democratic Party that we're able to do that, because if we don't, then it's a recipe for failure. Okay, it's a recipe for failure. So persons will have to put aside their bruised feelings, come together, make certain that there's understanding on what person's positions are on particular issues, and then move forward for the best interest of Texas and Democrats.
Got it. And more broadly, just on the idea of the party itself being able to come together after this runoff, how confident are you of that, regardless of what you may do with MJ or anything like that?
I think it's going to be very critical that MJ and I have conversations about it, because that's going to be very, very, very important in order to bring the party together. You know as well as I know that African Americans and Latinos and women and others are critical coalitions within this party. And if we're not able to bring those coalitions together, then it frankly is going to spell trouble for Democrats in the fall in Texas.
Right.
That's why it's important to provide leadership and say, listen, if you have bruised feelings, if I'm the nominee or if she's the nominee, I think whoever the nominee is needs to reach out to the other person and sit down and have a conversation, because I'm pretty certain that she will continue to have a base. I know I will have a base in Texas, and both bases will listen to us, and the majority of them will be swayed by exactly how we feel.
Right. Fast forwarding to where we are today in this race, you alluded to this earlier. There is some late ad spending on MJ Hegar's behalf by she's getting some help from the DSCC. She's getting some help from Emily's list. What is your campaign doing in these final days to try to counteract that, or just deal with that?
Well, I mean, it's David and Goliath. You know the story, okay? And I'm David. I've got a few stones, right? But we're going to make certain that we use those stones effectively and efficiently, and making sure we get our message out. And to the extent that we're able to get it out, I think we're going to be victorious on election day, or whenever the votes are finally counted.
Right. What are the tools that your campaign is using at the end here to communicate to voters and to make sure that you're doing all you can to go up against that?
Every tool, Patrick, every tool at our disposal. I'm not going to just kind of give you an itemization of all the tools we're using. That's ridiculous. I'll just put it this way. We're using every tool at our disposal in order to make certain that we do that. I'll just give you a couple right now. I'm trying to use in terms of the messengers that I have, okay? I mean, I've been endorsed by Joaquin Castro. Joaquin is helping me in the Hispanic community. I've been endorsed by Joe Moody out there in El Paso. I've been endorsed by Rodney Ellis, Jim Clyburn, Maxine Waters, Sylvia Garcia. I'm using those trusted messengers to help me get the word out in terms of why they're supporting me as a candidate for the United States Senate, in addition to other tools that we have at our disposal.
One other big development in the final days of this race, and it's not necessarily new because it happened last summer, but you're seeing John Cornyn's campaign today went up with a attack ad against you on TV. It's kind of similar to the one they ran against you last summer, a few tweaks here and there. But you've obviously seen an effort by them to meddle in this primary. Some political observers, who follow this stuff closely, think it's an effort to elevate you. People may have, there may be other opinions on that, but regardless of what you think the intended effect is, how are you assessing that? And what do you, what's your message to your voters or people who may be thinking about voting for you, who are either getting confused by this or wondering why John Cornyn is doing this?
It's a typical John Cornyn, okay? Now he's meddling in Democratic politics. Why, I don't know, okay? And I'm not really focused on why he's doing it. What I'm focused on right now is making certain that the roadmap, the blueprint that we've put in place in our campaign, that we are following that blueprint and that we're doing everything that we operationally have decided to do to make certain that I win. So whatever John Cornyn's doing and what his intent is, you got to talk to him. You ought to stop meddling now.
Are you okay with potentially benefiting from this? Because this is now at a point where it's real money that's being spent to meddle in the primary.
Let me just say this again. Whatever he's doing and the reason that he's doing it, Patrick, this is of no concern to me. What I'm saying to you is that whatever we're doing, we're going to continue to do. Let me give you an example. When I begin to look at the numbers the numbers of voters that have turned out, I recognize that the coalition has not turned out in the manner in which it needs to turn out. As an example, we've got 2.3 million Latino votes in the state of Texas. And I think it's, in terms of the total votes that have turned out so far, it's only about 19%, okay? When you begin to look at African-American votes, it's like 1.2 million. And they've turned out at a clip of maybe about 25, 26%. I'm focused on trying to get those parts of the coalition to vote. I'm not focused on John Cornyn. And to the extent that you're out there and you're looking at this, you need to make certain that you contact the persons within your communities and get them out to vote. That's what I'm focused on.
Got it. We've got about maybe 8 or 9 minutes left here. We have a few remaining viewer questions that I want to get to. This question is from Deborah. She says, you've been in the Texas Senate for a long time. Can you tell us about some of the legislation you have successfully worked on, which you are most proud? I know we touched on some of the criminal justice reform things you did earlier, but more broadly, what are some of your proudest legislative achievements?
Deborah, I'm very proud of the criminal justice legislation, education legislation. I've been able to bring the first public university to Dallas, the University of North Texas at Dallas. It now has over 4,000 students. I worked on bringing the Texas A&M campus to A&M, and needless to say, they're growing by bounds down there in South San Antonio, and also the A&M campus in Killeen, just to name a few. I've been responsible for reducing the cost of higher education in the state of Texas, doing a bill that I passed in the last legislative session. I've been given the Legislature of the Year award by the urban superintendents because of my work on HB 3, which was transformational legislation that was passed. And when you begin to think about probably one bill that I'm most proud of, I was able, when I was serving on the Health and Human Services Committee, I was appointed as a one-person subcommittee to find an alternative to foster care. How many of you know someone that's raising their grandchildren? Put your hands down. So what I was able to do is to pass kinship care programs. And essentially what that is that we now allow relatives of kids to be those persons that will adopt those kids that become wards of the state, and we give them a subsidy to help raise those kids. And when we begin to look at that program, my friends, over these many years, you'll see that they've had better outcomes than foster care. Those kids are staying with their biological families, they're graduating from high school, and yes, many of them are going on and are matriculating from college. So that's by far one of the most important bills that I've ever passed in the state Senate. I'd go on and on, but I know you want to entertain other questions also.
Thank you. We got another viewer question from, I may be getting this wrong name, but M. Cohn, it may be a username. But the question is, if elected, will you establish a Senate office in El Paso?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I will establish a Senate office in El Paso.
And I'll just jump in there. You mentioned earlier you've been able to reach all 254 counties as part of this campaign. I mean, how have you been able to reach out to some of these places that don't usually get as much attention outside of Dallas, Houston, San Antonio? El Paso is obviously a big city, but when you look at just in terms of running this campaign in the runoff, how have you been able to do that?
And I would welcome you to make sure you check this out too, by Zoom, okay? We've used this platform. The fact of the matter is that I have been on Zoom meetings on an average about 4 or 5 times a night, okay? Going sometimes until 9:30. I tell you what, Patrick, I felt like, you remember that Southwest Airlines commercial where the entertainer's on the stage and he may very well be in another city?
Right.
And he said, and he may very well be in Dallas, and then gets on the stage and says, "Thank you, Detroit." Okay, that's the type of outreach we've done. We've been all over the state of Texas having community meetings, participating in debate forums only to have me show up and no one else show up. Those are the types of things we've been doing.
Got it. Got just a couple questions left here from Garrett. Garrett, a little critical. I won't read the question exactly. A little critical of, quote, your digital media presence during the primary. And the question is, how are you preparing for a Senate campaign that will necessitate engaging voters digitally? So how are you looking toward the general election in terms of reaching voters digitally?
And Garrett, thank you very much. That critique is well-founded. We're doing a better job now of upgrading our game, so to speak, in terms of the digital platform. And frankly, that's where you're finding people now. And we are doing a better job of that. We will continue to upgrade our game as we go to the general election. Fair critique.
I'll jump in there too with another question in terms of the transition to the general election. How do you think fundraising will be different if you're the nominee? As I pointed out earlier, your opponents had a pretty big fundraising lead in this nominating contest. What do you think will change if you're the nominee in terms of rebuilding that money advantage, especially against John Cornyn?
We're going to nationalize this race. Okay, I assure you, when Democrats get tired of being victims of history, they can make history with me. Okay. And that making history also means that we've got to help with the load. And the load is going to be being able to raise the money here in the state of Texas and throughout this particular country. This will be a nationalized race, and hopefully the DNC will help get behind this and help me with the resources that I need in order to win. Well, I need $20, $30 million. As long as we're able to put out our social media program, I think we're going to be okay.
Got it. And just one last question here before we wind down. A question about term limits. I think you've addressed this in previous events, but can you just tell us, as a general question about term limits, where you stand on term limits? Do you support them? If so, for how long? For which offices?
Well, we've had this issue in the state Senate, and I've never been for term limits. But I will have a self-imposed term limit of no more than two terms.
If you're elected to the U.S. Senate?
No, when I'm elected to the U.S. Senate.
Right. And why do you think that's important?
Well, I think that, I've got to make certain that I build a pipeline, and that you build a pipeline of other people that can come behind you, and we need to be able to do that. And, by the time that I do that, I will have done the things that I needed to do in order to represent the state of Texas. So I think 12 years is enough time in the United States Senate.
Got it. Well, we've got just a couple minutes left here. Any closing thoughts? Again, I asked you your message to some of the voters who are seeing all this spending at the end and the meddling by Cornyn, but any closing thoughts on where the race is at?
This is what I'll say to you, that I've got knowledge, wisdom, and understanding, okay? And that knowledge has come as a result of listening to Texans. The understanding is understanding the process by which you take what you hear from them and make policy of them, or defeat policy. And the wisdom is the ability to be able to look back and see whether or not you were effective in addressing those particular issues. I've done that, my friends. I'll take that same work ethic, those same principles to the United States Senate. When you begin to think about the number of Texans that have endorsed me, when you begin to think about as an example, Patrick, the Texas County and District Attorney Association, the law enforcement organizations of this state have given me Legislature of the Year award. Different religious organizations have awarded my effort on behalf of the least of thee. I'll say to you, Texas, that you will be electing a person with the experience, the demonstrated ability to bring people together in Texas, that will be able to get things done. I've been fighting for you all these years as a state senator on Texas issues. I'll take that same effort and fight to Washington to represent your interests. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator West. That's just about out of time. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. Thank you to all our sponsors and partners for supporting today's event. And thank you again to Senator West for joining us. Finally, if you want to become a Texas Tribune member and support our ongoing election coverage, go to texastribune.org/give. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. Take care, and thanks again for joining us.
Take care.